On February 20th, 2025, the city of Carrollton, Georgia, was shaken by a brutal crime. Kristen and James Brock, a couple who seemed to have overcome past challenges and rebuilt their lives, were found dead in their own home. The tragedy began in a shocking way. A child of only 5 years old, James's daughter from a previous marriage, entered the couple's bedroom and found them lifeless, with blood splattered on the floor and her parents' bodies motionless. The authorities were quickly called, and the scene proved even more disturbing. Police found the bodies of Kristen, 41, and James, 45, both shot to death while they slept. Most alarming was the lack of signs of struggle or resistance. It seemed the killers knew exactly what they were doing. There was no forced entry or signs that anyone had broken into the house. What appeared to be a crime committed within the family began to unravel as an even greater mystery. Since the door was only slightly ajar and nothing else was out of place, investigators quickly concluded that whoever did this had an intimate knowledge of the family's routine. The first person to arrive at the crime scene was Sarah Grace Patrick, James's adopted daughter and Kristen's 17-year-old stepdaughter. She was responsible for calming her younger sister and calling the police, but soon something strange began to emerge. While the police investigated and tried to understand what had happened, Sarah behaved too calmly for someone who had just lost her parents. She quickly returned to her normal routine, going back to school a few days later. Without showing the expected emotional impact, the case took an even more mysterious turn when it was discovered that, prior to the murders, Sarah had curiously engaged with true crime influencers on social media. She contacted them, suggesting they cover her parents a case. These messages suggested that, instead of grieving the tragedy, Sarah was attempting to control the public narrative surrounding the crime, treating the situation as if it were entertainment. This raised suspicions about her possible connection to the murders, something that would become central to the case. And this story just keeps getting more interesting. If you're finding all of this shocking, be sure to subscribe to our channel. The story is far from over, and what comes next is truly surprising. Stay with us until the end to understand all the details of this intriguing and disturbing case. Following the brutal murder of Kristen and James Brock, Sarah Grace Patrick, the couple's adopted daughter, found herself at the center of an investigation that quickly gained attention. Sarah's reaction to the tragedy, or rather, her lack of emotional reaction, caught the attention of many. At a time that should have been one of grief and shock, Sarah behaved in a surprisingly calm and controlled manner. She tried to continue her routine, returning to school just days after the murder. Her friends and teachers noticed that her demeanor was almost too calm for someone who had just lost 2 parents, especially in such a traumatic situation. Sarah didn't seem to show the anguish one would expect from someone at such a moment. Her public demeanor appeared to be that of a young woman dealing with loss in a normal way, but the lack of tears and visible emotions caused unease among those around her. Not only that, she also maintained an extremely composed posture during her parents' funeral. When she ascended the church pulpit to say goodbye to James and Kristen, she delivered a speech that impressed those present. Her words were extremely eloquent, well-structured, and controlled. The absence of tears on her face was disconcerting to those who heard her speech. Sarah, with her excessive calm, stood out as the only person at the funeral who seemed completely serene, while everyone around her was clearly devastated by the loss. The way she spoke about the loss of her parents did not reflect the genuine grief that others were displaying. Those present began to whisper, questioning whether Sarah was truly grieving or if her lack of emotion might be indicative of something more sinister. To many, she seemed more interested in controlling the situation than in expressing her grief. This behavior aroused suspicions that something was amiss, but what no one knew yet was what was going on in Sarah's mind. She seemed to be dealing with the tragedy in a completely atypical way, which could indicate psychotic behavior, or, conversely, an attempt to manipulate and control the narrative around her. Her cold approach, combined with the fact that, instead of engaging in grief, she was creating a story about the murders, raised a number of questions. However, no one knew exactly what was happening behind the scenes. The most frightening thing was yet to come. After the funeral, Sarah continued her seemingly normal life, but investigators soon discovered something alarming. While most of the population would be in a state of shock and mourning, Sarah was acting completely differently. She dedicated herself intensely to consuming content about true crimes, specifically murder cases and police investigations. It was a common interest for many teenagers, but for Sarah, This fascination seemed to have gone beyond a simple hobby. Within days, she had connected with several true crime influencers on social media, sending private messages to various content creators, suggesting they investigate her parents' case. She wasn't just interested in learning more about what had happened to them. She was actively trying to control how the case would be portrayed publicly. Sarah's messages to the true crime influencers were remarkably professional, almost as if she were trying to turn her parents' murder into an entertainment product. The words she used to describe the tragedy were shocking. She treated the case of her parents, brutally murdered in their beds, as something interesting, something worthy of being covered on a YouTube channel or Instagram page. Sarah's messages were disconcerting, as if she were more interested in how her story would be told than in grieving the loss of her parents. She contacted several true crime influencers with a well-crafted strategy to publicize the case. In one of the messages, Sarah even told an influencer, "I was wondering if you could cover my parents' murder case. It's super interesting, and I think your audience would love it." The choice of words was shocking to the influencer, who felt deeply uncomfortable with the request. It was as if Sarah was treating her parents' murder as a fictional crime case, something to be analyzed for clues and theories, instead of a profoundly traumatic and devastating event for her family. The influencer, visibly disturbed, immediately reported the message to the authorities, who began investigating Sarah's interactions on social media. What appeared to be an attempt to manipulate public opinion and create a narrative for the case, even before any suspicion fell on her, became a vital clue in the investigation. Not only that, but other similar messages were found, indicating that Sarah was doing this systematically, reaching out to various influencers in an attempt to shape the case in a way that would favor her image and shield her guilt. Sarah's messages were undoubtedly strange behavior for a young woman supposedly traumatized by the death of her parents, which further raised suspicions of her involvement in the crime. Initially, the defense tried to argue that Sarah was simply trying to process the loss of her parents in a way that was comfortable for her. Her involvement with true crime influencers could be, according to her lawyers, an attempt to get answers, a peculiar way of dealing with grief. However, the prosecutors saw the situation very differently. They believed that Sarah was trying to control the narrative and manage how the case would be perceived by the public. Even before being formally charged, Sarah's story was taking an even more sinister turn. What had seemed like a grieving young woman began to transform into a carefully planned strategy to deflect suspicion and create a public image of innocence. As the investigation continued, more and more evidence began to emerge, suggesting that Sarah was more involved in her parents' death than anyone could have imagined. But the story doesn't end here. Stay with us until the end, because the next steps in the investigation and the outcome of this case promise to be even more shocking. If you're curious about how all this will unfold, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any details. What comes next is truly surprising. In the courtroom, Sarah Grace Patrick's image stood out from the heavy atmosphere. She entered smiling, confident, as if she believed she would leave on bail. The defense presented the 17-year-old as someone with no criminal record, a diligent student, a churchgoer, incapable of planning anything violent. The first witnesses reinforced this portrait. Religious leaders, friends, and adults who took her in after the tragedy spoke of a polite, cooperative, calm teenager who helped with homework and maintained her school routine despite her grief. Each statement seemed to lay a brick on the bridge to provisional release. But this construction began to crack when the prosecution, patiently, started to assemble another mosaic. The tone changed with the recollection of the wake. While most broke down in tears, Sarah spoke without breaking her voice. The prosecution didn't say that the lack of crying proved guilt, but suggested that the coldness formed a pattern, the same pattern that would be seen online, in messages to true crime creators, sent, according to the prosecution, to transform the case into content and shape the narrative. Instead of pain, strategy. Instead of silence, reach. The social media jury, the state insinuated, was being summoned even before the justice system spoke. The emotional turning point came when James's sister took the floor. Her voice was choked with emotion, her pauses long, her pain raw and evident. She described sleepless nights, the silent house that insists on repeating the sound of gunshots, the emptiness of the dates that once brought the family together. He asked the judge to deny bail, invoking the safety of the child who found his parents, the fear of reliving the horror. The impact of the violence that doesn't fade when the hearing ends. A text written by James's 12-year-old son was read next. Few lines, but of unbearable weight. The loss of his father, the incomprehension, the question that finds no answer. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Then came the technical points. Contradictions in Sarah's account of the night of the crime, the mention of the LVAD alarm that allegedly sounded, a medical detail that, according to the prosecution, is inconsistent with the idea of deep sleep and no noise heard. The prosecution stressed that these were not final conclusions, but indications that, taken together, suggested a risk of flight, danger to the community, and the possibility of interference with the investigation. The defense countered, insisting on her adolescence, the absence of a criminal record, the support of her church and biological family, offering supervision, a fixed address, electronic monitoring, all to dispel the image of a threat. The judge listened, took notes, and asked for parts to be repeated. He said he understood the defense's efforts, acknowledged the human weight of what was happening there, but pointed to what he called a worrying set of factors: the seriousness of the facts, the pattern of behavior described, the accounts from family members on the victim's side, and the elements that are still awaiting complete forensic analysis. The decision was swift. Bail denied. Sarah would remain detained until further developments. Her expression changed. The initial smile gave way to a fixed gaze, as if the carefully prepared narrative had been snatched from her hands and given to another voice. The hearing ended, but it felt like a beginning, because behind that closed door, pieces were still missing. Expert results, in-depth analysis of the devices, answers about the missing weapon, and, above all, the question that has permeated the case from the very first minute. The story, for now, remains suspended, poised to reveal what has not yet been said. As the investigation into the murders of Kristen and James Brock progressed, new clues and contradictions emerged in Sarah Grace Patrick's behavior. The image of the grieving and innocent teenager, painted by the defense, was gradually undone by evidence suggesting something darker. The coldness shown by Sarah during the funeral, her strange behavior on social media, and especially the discovery of messages sent to true crime influencers, began to weave a completely different narrative. But what really caught the investigators' attention was Sarah's behavior in the hours leading up to the murders. On the morning of the crime, when James and Kristen's bodies were found, Sarah was one of the first to enter the room where her parents lay dead. The scene was horrific, with bodies scattered across the floor in a scene of brutal violence. However, Sarah's behavior that morning was curious. She rushed to calm her younger sister, Jay, who had been the first to find their parents, and then called the police. Although her reaction might seem normal to someone in a state of shock, something stood out to the investigators: Sarah's excessive calmness. She seemed in control of the situation, as if she already knew what to do. Without the typical anguish of someone dealing with the sudden and violent death of their parents. When the police arrived at the scene, it didn't seem to fit the pattern of a crime committed by an intruder. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle. The fact that the bedroom door was only slightly ajar, and the absence of any disturbance in the house raised an immediate hypothesis. The killer knew exactly what he was doing, and had intimate knowledge of the family's routine. This indicated to the investigators that the person responsible for the crime was someone from inside the house. However, nothing had prepared the investigators for the most disturbing discovery. Sarah was among the first to be considered a suspect, although her initial position was that of a victim. The first concrete clue linking Sarah to the crime emerged during an analysis of her actions in the weeks following her parents' death. While most people in her situation would be immersed in grief, Sarah seemed focused on something quite different: creating a public narrative about the case. She began actively engaging on social media, specifically with true crime influencers, asking them to cover her parents' case. The messages she sent were almost identical in content, as if she were trying to create a plot, a story she could control, turning her parents' murder into a spectacle for the public. In one message, Sarah wrote to a true crime influencer, "I was wondering if you could cover my parents' murder case. It's super interesting, and I think your audience would love it." The phrase, "super interesting," came as a shock to those who read it, as it seemed to treat the death of her own parents as something worthy of being consumed as entertainment. For investigators, this pursuit of attention on social media didn't appear to be a form of mourning. but rather an attempt at manipulation, a way to control how the case would be perceived even before any formal charges were filed. Sarah was trying to ensure the story was told the way she wanted, instead of dealing with the pain of loss or seeking justice for her parents. This discovery was one of the most significant for the prosecution, which saw it as evidence that Sarah wasn't just processing her grief, but orchestrating a public campaign to protect her image and potentially cover up her responsibility. But Sarah's behavior on social media wasn't the only aspect that caught the investigators' attention. Inconsistencies in her accounts of the day of the murders began to appear in her first interviews with the police. She said she only woke up after her sister called her. But there's a critical detail that couldn't be ignored: the alarm on James's LVAD, ventricular assist device. This device emitted a very loud, audible alert on the night of the crime, a sound that was impossible to ignore. Even if Sarah was fast asleep, it was highly unlikely she wouldn't have heard the alarm. She herself later confirmed in her testimony that she had heard the alarm around 11:40 or 11:50 the previous night, shortly before going to bed. The LVAD emits a shrill sound when there are serious malfunctions, such as power outages or heart problems, and Sarah didn't mention worrying about the alarm or getting up to check on James. She stated that she simply ignored the sound and went to sleep. This detail was crucial for the investigators, as it indicated that Sarah was not completely unaware of the events, as she had claimed. The fact that Sarah heard the alarm but didn't react while shots were being fired in the house raised even more suspicions. For the police, it was impossible to believe she hadn't heard the shots, especially considering the alarm's loud and persistent sound. Contradictions in her testimony piled up. She claimed not to have heard anything unusual, but the physical evidence and the circumstances surrounding her parents' deaths suggested otherwise. Investigators began piecing together a puzzle that increasingly pointed to Sarah as the prime suspect. Furthermore, the crime scene left no doubt about the nature of the murder. James and Kristen had been killed while they slept, shot at close range. The fact that there were no signs of struggle, defense, or any kind of resistance indicated that the two were in a state of total vulnerability, probably unaware of what would hit them. The proximity of the shots, the fact that the victims had no time to defend themselves, showed that the killer had approached silently, which reinforced the theory that it was someone who had access to the house, someone from within the family. Details about the use of the weapon and the search for its origin began to intensify. The murder weapon was never found, indicating that Sarah may have disposed of it, hidden it, or even destroyed it before the police had a chance to conduct a full forensic examination. The lack of a registered firearm in the name of any family member and investigations into the possibility that Sarah obtained the weapon illegally led the police to question whether she acted alone or if there were others involved. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear: Sarah's actions and behavior continued to raise more questions than answers. As more evidence emerged, the case of Sarah Grace Patrick became more complex and disturbing, and the mystery surrounding the murders of Sarah's parents was far from solved. The investigation into the murders of Kristen and James Brock continued to take increasingly dark and complex turns. As the details of the case unfolded, one truth was becoming clearer: Sarah Grace Patrick was at the center of it all, and her actions in the weeks following the murders suggested much more than that of a simply grieving young woman. The police began to paint a picture of Sarah that distanced itself from the image of an innocent teenager and victim of circumstances. Evidence continued to emerge, and Sarah's behavior became increasingly disconcerting, fueling suspicions that she had been responsible for the murders of her parents. Sarah's coldness and controlled demeanor in the face of the tragedy drew even more attention. It wasn't just her reaction on social media that raised questions, but also the way she handled the situation after the murders. Although she showed solidarity and involvement in the funeral, what appeared to be a moment of mourning was, for many, a cold and calculated performance. Sarah's posture in the face of her parents' death was not compatible with the grief expected of someone who had lost two such important figures in their life. Her lack of tears, her firm voice, and the way she spoke at the ceremony, without breaking down or showing genuine suffering, led many to wonder if she was truly feeling the loss or if she was merely fulfilling a social role, as if she were playing a part in a real-life theater. This coldness contrasted sharply with the behavior of the other people present at the funeral, who were visibly devastated. James and Kristen's friends and family were heartbroken, and the loss seemed incalculable to them. However, Sarah seemed emotionally disconnected, as if she were in a state of total control over her emotions, as if her real concern was how others perceived her. Her lack of genuine emotional reaction in the most intense circumstances of grief raised a red flag for investigators, who began to reassess everything they knew about her. Furthermore, Sarah's strange behavior wasn't limited to the funeral. Her involvement with true crime influencers in the weeks following the murder was particularly alarming. It wasn't an isolated case, but rather a pattern. Sarah began reaching out to true crime influencers on social media, asking them to investigate her parents' case and turn it into content for their followers. She seemed more concerned with what others thought about the tragedy than with the actual pain that the loss of her parents should have caused. In her messages, she treated her parents' death as an intriguing mystery, worthy of being explored as part of a true crime show, without the slightest consideration for the victims' pain. She even went so far as to send identical messages to several influencers, seeking to exploit her personal grief as a narrative for public entertainment. "I was wondering if you could cover my parents' case. I think your audience would love the story." One of Sarah's messages to a true crime influencer read. To investigators, this attitude was disconcerting. How could someone treat the death of their own parents in such a cold and impersonal way, as if it were a story to be consumed by an audience eager for scandals? It didn't seem that Sarah was trying to understand what had happened or cope with her grief, but rather to manipulate the situation to her advantage, controlling the narrative of how she would be seen publicly. Meanwhile, contradictions in Sarah's testimony continued to mount. She claimed she was fast asleep when the shots were fired in the house, but there was crucial evidence that couldn't be ignored: the alarm from the LVAD, James's cardiac device, which emitted a loud, insistent sound during the night of the crime. Sarah stated that she heard the alarm and that it woke her, but that she simply ignored the sound and went back to sleep. For investigators, this was a glaring flaw in her narrative. The LVAD alarm was designed to be impossible to ignore, a sound so loud and distressing that it would wake anyone. The fact that Sarah said she didn't hear the gunshots but did hear the alarm generated growing skepticism about the veracity of her testimony. Sarah appeared to be trying to protect herself from a logical fallacy in her own account. She insisted she was fast asleep, unaware of the gunshots. Yet when questioned, she was able to accurately describe the sound of the alarm. This, in itself, suggested she was aware of events around her, but was attempting to create a convenient explanation for her actions, or lack thereof. When questioned about why she didn't check on her father after the alarm, Sarah stated she didn't feel it was necessary. However, the police couldn't understand how she could be so indifferent to such a critical situation, especially knowing the alarm was related to her father's health, which was at risk due to his serious heart condition. The police began to wonder if Sarah had acted calculatingly throughout the night, ignoring warning signs, perhaps to buy herself enough time to commit the crime. Or was she so engrossed in her own scheme to create a public narrative that she lost control of the events around her? The questions continued to multiply as more and more inconsistencies emerged in the case. The forensic examination of the crime scene revealed further disturbing clues. The shots were fired at close range, suggesting that the killer was very close to the victims when they were killed, likely while they were sleeping. There were no signs of struggle or resistance, indicating that James and Kristen had no time to react before being killed. The accuracy of the shots and the absence of signs of defense led investigators to believe that the person responsible for the crime had a deep knowledge of the family's routine and habits, reinforcing the theory that the crime was committed by someone from inside the house, someone who was deeply familiar with the victim's behavior. But there was one piece still missing: the murder weapon. It was never found. The police searched every corner of the house, the garden, and even the surrounding areas, but the weapon simply vanished. This raised the possibility that Sarah had disposed of the weapon after the murder, possibly throwing it into a body of water or hiding it somewhere still unidentified. But where did the weapon go, and why did Sarah never mention its use or its possible location? This mystery, involving the murder weapon and the disappearance of such a vital clue, continued to hang over the case, keeping investigators constantly searching for answers. Although they were beginning to build an incriminating case against Sarah, there were still many details to be resolved. How would it all fit together? The answer to these questions was far from clear, and the tension continued to grow as the case approached a turning point. As Sarah Grace Patrick's case continued to unfold, The investigation reached a crucial stage. Each detail seemed more revealing than the last, yet the police still faced a major challenge: the lack of a fundamental piece to solve the puzzle. Although the evidence against Sarah was mounting, the great mystery that still hung over the case was the murder weapon. It was never found, and this made it difficult to conclude the case. Without the weapon, the police could not confirm what had really happened on the night of the murders. Although all the evidence pointed to Sarah, the lack of this essential item still left a void that needed to be filled. While the police tried to track down any clues that could lead to the location of the weapon, Sarah remained the focus of the investigation. Her behavior in the weeks following her parents' death only heightened suspicions. Her attempt to control the narrative of the case on social media, by contacting true crime influencers and asking for public coverage, was a clear indication that she was not dealing with the loss in a conventional way. For many, her obsession with creating a story about her parents' death and turning it into content for public entertainment was a sign that she was more concerned with manipulating public opinion than with grieving itself. The way Sarah handled her parents' death was troubling, but what truly brought her behavior into the spotlight was the discovery of messages sent to various true crime influencers. In her messages, she described the case as super interesting, a shocking term for someone who was wider theoretically, grieving the loss of two central figures in her life. These messages were structured almost mechanically, as if Sarah were trying to sell the case in a planned way, without the slightest consideration for the pain involved. This type of behavior was not that of a teenager who lost her parents in tragic circumstances, but rather that of someone trying to control the narrative and shape how the world would see what had happened. Furthermore, Sarah's behavior after the crime continued to be anomalous. Not only did she avoid showing emotion at the funeral, but she also returned to her routine with impressive speed. Within days, she was back at school, and teachers reported that she seemed calm and composed, lacking the typical signs of deep grief one would expect from someone in her situation. While other students expressed sadness and confusion, Sarah appeared to be a young woman simply going about her daily business, as if nothing had changed in her life. This lack of an emotional response commensurate with the trauma she had suffered generated growing distrust about her true intentions. Over time, it became clear to the prosecution that the evidence pointed to Sarah as the prime suspect in the crime. The contradictory account of the night of the murders was one of the strongest points of the prosecution's case. Sarah claimed she was fast asleep when the shots were fired, but a crucial piece of information deconstructed this version: the alarm on the LVAD, the device that helped keep James's heart beating, had emitted a loud and persistent sound during the night. Sarah stated that she heard the alarm, but did not get up to check what was happening. Instead, she went back to sleep. Sarah's explanation for ignoring the alarm was questioned by the police. How could someone hear such an intense sound and not react, especially when her father's life was at risk? This detail seemed more like an attempt to justify her failure to act, since if she had gotten up, she would have quickly realized that something was wrong and that her parents' death might be imminent. This inaction, when the alarm indicated a serious problem with James's heart, was seen by investigators as a sign of indifference and even possible involvement in the crime. The fact that Sarah didn't mention the gunshots or show surprise at her parents' deaths also raised further suspicions. She claimed she didn't hear the shots, which seemed highly improbable given the proximity of the shots and the violence of the crime. How could a young girl be so oblivious to what was happening in her own home, especially considering the alarm and the possibility of having heard the gunshots? This disconnect from events was one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence that made investigators wonder if Sarah was, in fact, trying to cover up her own involvement in the crime. Meanwhile, the investigations continued to focus on finding the murder weapon. It was the key to directly linking Sarah to the murders, but the police were unable to locate it. The search for this weapon became a priority, but, until then, it remained missing. This raised a number of questions about how Sarah could have disposed of it so quickly, without leaving a trace. Many wondered if she had discarded it in a river or buried it in some remote location. The fact that there were no registered weapons in the name of any family member also increased the suspicion that Sarah might have obtained the weapon through illegal means, perhaps from a friend, acquaintance, or even a clandestine transaction. The disappearance of the weapon also raised another question. Could Sarah have been helped by someone, or had she acted alone? The police considered the possibility that she had an accomplice, but there was still no concrete evidence to support this theory. However, The pressure on Sarah increased as more and more evidence accumulated against her, and the case seemed to be approaching a critical point. At the same time, Sarah's behavior towards her family and acquaintances continued to be examined. Her friends and teachers described her as a reserved young woman, but with no history of violent or disruptive behavior. She seemed to be a good student, involved in school and religious activities. However, members of Kristen and James's family began to report tensions within the home before the murders. Some suggested that Sarah had behavioral problems and that there were disagreements with her adoptive parents. These reports raised further questions about the possible motives for the crime, with the police now focusing on family relationships and possible conflicts that could have led Sarah to make the decision to kill her parents. The investigation into the murders was far from over, but the pressure on Sarah was mounting. Each new discovery seemed to point to her guilt, but the lack of the murder weapon still cast a shadow of uncertainty. For the investigators, the case was still far from solved, and the answers to the most crucial questions were still somewhere, waiting to be discovered. As the investigation into the murders of Kristen and James Brock deepened, the pressure on Sarah Grace Patrick mounted. The lack of conclusive evidence, such as the murder weapon, still left significant gaps in the story. However, what seemed clear to investigators was that Sarah was deeply involved in the case. Her actions, both before and after her parents' deaths, indicated behavior that seemed calculated and far removed from that of a young woman traumatized by the loss of her parents. Contrary to what the defense tried to claim, the signs pointed to something darker, something far more premeditated. As police scrutinized every detail of Sarah's life, data collected from her personal devices began to yield more crucial information. Analysis of her phones, computers, and other electronic devices revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior. Through meticulous investigation of her online activity, investigators discovered that Sarah had conducted specific searches on how to dispose of a weapon, how to conceal evidence, and, most alarmingly, how to tamper with a crime scene. The messages she had sent to true crime influencers were not merely an attempt to gain public attention or manipulate the narrative. They appeared to be part of a larger effort to understand how crimes were solved, how investigations worked, and somehow how she could avoid being caught. Furthermore, Sarah's messages to true crime influencers revealed a clear attempt to position herself as a victim, something that, according to the prosecution, was a form of control. She not only wanted the case to be exploited, but also tried to direct how the media and the public should view the situation. This indicated an awareness far beyond that of a grieving teenager. The idea of treating her parents' murder as content to attract an audience was a turning point in the case. For investigators, this demonstrated not only coldness, but also an intention to shape the case before being formally charged. Sarah was, in many ways, trying to control how her image would be projected, and this made her position as a possible murderer even more convincing. Although the police had found a considerable amount of digital evidence, the major obstacle remained the lack of the murder weapon. Without it, the prosecution would not have a direct physical link between Sarah and her parents' deaths. However, the investigation continued to explore other forms of connection. Interviews with Sarah's family and friends brought to light more information about the relationships within the home. Although the defense attempted to portray Sarah as an ordinary young woman without serious problems, testimonies from people close to her indicated that there were tensions within the family. Some family members reported that Sarah frequently demonstrated frustration with her family situation and the rules imposed by her adoptive parents. While these tensions were not any immediately proof that Sarah was capable of committing such a brutal crime, they began to suggest an environment where anger and resentment may have been accumulating over time. The police also began to explore James Brock's medical history, specifically his LVAD device, which had been a significant factor in the case. The alarm from this device, which Sarah claimed to have heard on the night of the crime, was another crucial point. If she had indeed heard the alarm, it meant she was awake at a critical moment but still did nothing. The police began to question whether she was, in fact, acting deliberately, choosing to ignore the alarm and not try to wake her father to check on his health. This contradiction, between claiming to have heard the alarm and taking no action, was seen as a major flaw in her testimony, which now seemed more like an attempt to conceal her true involvement in the crime. In addition to digital evidence and family accounts, police also focused on forensic analysis of the crime scene. Although the weapon had not yet been found, investigators discovered that the position of Kristen and James's bodies, the way the shots were fired, and the lack of signs of a struggle indicated that the victims were likely asleep when they were attacked. The absence of defensive marks, such as scratches or wounds, suggested that the two had no time or chance to react. Investigators believed that whoever committed the crime knew exactly how to attack quickly and efficiently. This reinforced the theory that the killer was familiar with the house's routine, knew the schedules, and likely the victims' vulnerabilities. Sarah, as the family's adopted daughter, seemed an obvious candidate for this person with access to the house and knowledge of the routine. However, the biggest obstacle for the prosecution was the lack of a direct physical connection between Sarah and the crime, which could only be established through the weapon. Without it, the prosecution had a series of circumstantial evidence, but not irrefutable proof that Sarah fired the gun that killed her parents. Even with digital data and incriminating testimonies, without the weapon, the prosecution needed to be sure they were building a case solid enough to support the charges in court. This increased the pressure on the investigators. The search for the murder weapon became a matter of time and persistence. Meanwhile, Sarah's behavior continued to be analyzed. She was now in custody, awaiting the next stages of the judicial process. The defense was still trying to argue that she was a traumatized teenager who needed psychological help instead of punishment. They wanted to shape the narrative that she didn't understand the consequences of her actions due to her age and emotional state after the tragedy. However, for the prosecutors, the issue was clear. The relentless pursuit of controlling the narrative on social media, the contradictions in her testimonies, and the lack of any genuine emotional reaction to her parents' death were signs that Sarah knew exactly what she was doing, and her attempt to manipulate public perception indicated a calculating mind. Something was still missing to conclude the case. The pressure to find the murder weapon was high, as it was the key to closing the circle and ensuring that the accusation against Sarah was solid. But while the police continued to sift through the case, new discoveries were about to emerge, changes in the investigation that could shed new light on the events of that fateful night. What seemed to be a logical solution was still out of reach, and Sarah's case continued to unfold, full of mysteries and unresolved questions. The end was closer, but the final pieces still needed to fall into place. As Sarah Grace Patrick's case neared a turning point, new information and discoveries began to emerge, further complicating the investigation. The search for the still missing murder weapon remained the top priority for investigators, but circumstantial evidence against Sarah was mounting, making it increasingly difficult for her to maintain the facade of an innocent and traumatized young woman. One of the major turning points in the case occurred when the police began investigating the financial records of Sarah and her adoptive parents. Investigators wanted to understand if there was any financial motivation behind the crime, or if Sarah had any hidden interest in the family's assets. At first, it seemed there wasn't much to be found, as the Brock family didn't have substantial assets. However, a closer review of the records revealed something intriguing. Sarah had recently done online research related to inheritances and wills. She seemed interested in learning more about what would happen to her parents' assets if something happened to them. Sarah's research into inheritances raised a red flag for investigators. While family tensions were a significant factor, there was also the possible element of greed involved. This not only indicated that Sarah had some interest in what would happen to the family fortune, but also suggested that she might have had personal motives for wanting her parents gone. This new development caused investigators to reassess their theories about the motive for the crime. The idea that the murder had been planned with the aim of obtaining financial gain seemed increasingly plausible. But as investigations deepened into the possible financial motive, evidence of emotional manipulation on Sarah's part continued to emerge. Her constant attempts to control the public narrative surrounding her parents' death, especially through seeking coverage from true crime influencers, became even more suspicious. Sarah's behavior on social media, where she seemed more concerned with generating engagement than dealing with her grief, led many to question her true nature. For many, she wasn't just coping with the pain of a tragedy, but was creating a crime story she wanted to be consumed by an audience, turning her parents' death into something almost banal, worthy of a documentary. Meanwhile, Sarah's behavior inside the prison continued to be monitored. She appeared calm and cooperative, but the psychologists evaluating her reported concerning behaviors. In several interviews with specialists, Sarah demonstrated impressive emotional control. She seemed to perfectly understand the gravity of the situation, but never gave in to genuine emotion. This contrasted with the behavior of a young woman who should be grieving the loss of her parents. Furthermore, the therapy sessions Sarah attended began to reveal something even more alarming. She seemed to minimize her own guilt, suggesting that she might have been a victim of circumstances and family pressure. To the psychologists, this attitude reflected a manipulative personality, someone capable of disguising their true intentions under a facade of normalcy. But it wasn't just the psychologists who had concerns about Sarah's behavior. Her fellow inmates began reporting strange behaviors on her part. Some guards and inmates said that Sarah often showed excessive interest in how the people around her reacted to her case. She asked questions about the progress of the investigations, and even about how people perceived her behavior. In conversations with other prisoners, she tried to soften the image others had of her, saying that she was not guilty and that it was all a big mistake. To many, she seemed more concerned with her image than with the fact that she was accused of such a serious crime. Meanwhile, the search for the murder weapon continued, and the pressure on investigators mounted. One of the biggest challenges for the police was understanding how Sarah could have disposed of the weapon without leaving a trace. The investigation into the weapon's disappearance led police to question whether Sarah might have had help hiding the weapon or disposing of evidence. During interviews with her friends and family, rumors surfaced that she might have associated with people outside her family circle who had access to weapons. Although these leads didn't yield any concrete findings, they broadened the scope of the investigation, which was now exploring the possibility that Sarah had acted with the help of others. The fact that the weapon was never found was one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Although there was much circumstantial evidence pointing to Sarah, the fact that she wasn't directly linked to the murder weapon left a gap in the case. This meant the prosecution needed to be extremely careful in building its case, as without this crucial evidence, there was a chance Sarah could be found innocent in court. Discussions within the prosecution began to revolve around how to address this lack of evidence without weakening the case. Many believed that the digital evidence, messages sent to true crime influencers, and Sarah's cold and calculated demeanor could be enough to convince the jury of her guilt. However, some lawyers were concerned that the weapon's disappearance might leave room for reasonable doubt. As the case neared trial, Sarah's defense was attempting to reinforce its argument that she was a traumatized young woman, unable to fully comprehend the consequences of her actions. They were still trying to portray Sarah as a victim of circumstances, an emotionally overwhelmed teenager from a dysfunctional family. For the defense, the focus was on depicting Sarah as someone who had no control over her own life, and who, in a moment of desperation, had committed an impulsive act without full awareness of what she was doing. They argued that she needed psychological treatment and support, not severe punishment. The prosecution, on the other hand, was determined to prove that Sarah had acted with full knowledge and control, orchestrating a crime with coldness and premeditation. Digital evidence, messages sent to influencers, the lack of emotion at the funeral, and manipulative behavior in prison were presented as clear signs that Sarah was not a victim, but a cunning manipulator. The absence of the weapon, while a challenge, was not enough to weaken the case. According to the prosecutors, they believed they had sufficient evidence that Sarah was responsible for the murders of her parents. While preparations for the trial were underway, the tension only increased. The case was about to become one of the most talked about in the country, and details continued to unfold in surprising ways. Sarah Grace Patrick's fate was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. The legal battle was far from over, and the truth behind Kristen and James Brock's deaths was yet to come. As Sarah Grace Patrick's case neared trial, the tension between the evidence, testimonies, and legal interpretations became untenable. The absence of the murder weapon, still a significant obstacle, did not prevent the prosecution from building a solid case based on Sarah's incriminating behaviors, the manipulation of the crime narrative through social media, her contradictions in accounts, and the lack of a genuine emotional reaction to her parents' death. These factors, combined with her research on how to cover up a crime and manipulate investigations, formed an increasingly clear picture of someone with knowledge and intent, not a traumatized teenager out of control of her actions. On the other hand, Sarah's defense attempted to paint a picture of a young woman who, overwhelmed by her family environment and the pressure of her own emotionally tumultuous life, made an irreversible mistake but did not fully understand the consequences of her actions. For the defense, Sarah was a victim of circumstances, needing psychological support and not severe punishment. This argument, while understandable from the perspective of a teenager with a complex family history, seemed increasingly unsustainable in the face of the coldness and premeditation that emerged throughout the investigations. Throughout the process, it became clear that the case was not simply a family crime, but a story involving manipulation, a struggle for control of the narrative, and a young woman who, instead of surrendering to grief, seemed to be seeking to protect herself and manage her image amidst a tragedy. The lack of a physical weapon to directly link Sarah to the murders was undoubtedly a crucial point, but the body of circumstantial evidence seemed strong enough to ensure that the case reached a definitive verdict. Thus, while Sarah's fate rested in the hands of the court, the case revealed much more than a family crime story. It exposed the complexities of family relationships, the impact of social media on human behavior, and the issues of emotional manipulation that are often invisible even to those directly involved. Sarah Grace Patrick's trial would not only be a test of her guilt, but a reflection of the society in which we live, where the boundaries between public and private, between genuine grief and image control, continue to become increasingly blurred.